Hello there, and welcome to Empoword Journalism's latest workshop. In this workshop, we spoke with Deborah Haynes, Sky News Foreign Affairs Editor. She joined Sky in 2018, but prior to this, she was the defence editor and Iraq correspondent for The Times. In 2008, she won the Amnesty International and the inaugural Bevins Prize for her human rights reporting. In this workshop, she spoke with Yasmin and Orla from Empoword Journalism to talk a little bit about her pathway into journalism and some of the challenges that she's faced along the way. As always, if you've got any questions, please do feel free to leave them in the comments. And to find out more about our next series of workshops, please do get in contact with us on our social media pages, which can be found in the description.
Okay, so we're just going to get straight into the questions then. So firstly, it's just simple. How did you get into journalism? Like, what route did you take?
Sure. So I always wanted to be a journalist from literally as far back as I can remember. Like, I can remember being obsessed, like watching television news when I was about 6 or 7. And then I went to school in Camberley. And when I was doing my GCSEs, they had that thing where you can go and do 2 weeks work placement. And my teacher sent me off to the Aldershot News. So I did my first sort of experience when I was 15 on the Aldershot News, and I absolutely loved it. And I remember when I went to university, I wanted to study I really like languages. And I think for any journalist who is interested in international affairs, being able to speak languages is such a huge skill, a really important skill, and helps to set you apart in a really crowded field. And I've been obsessed with Japan from when I was really young. So all I wanted to do was speak Japanese. And so that was my plan, was to go and do a law degree with Japanese. And the 2 universities that I had offers from were Leeds and Cardiff. And when I looked that year, like, Cardiff won the student newspaper competition. So I was like, right, that's clearly a sign. And like the first thing I did, like on my first day at university, was sign up to the Gare Read, which was the Cardiff newspaper. And I did like this sort of weekly column, which was it was like on a Wednesday night, which was like the students' night. I'd go out and get vox pops. Wasn't particularly insightful, but that was, you have to start somewhere. And I'm really passionate about people in journalism is, to get as much work experience as you can from as soon as you can, really. And so I did a lot. I applied for every single possible, graduate trainee scheme. I remember going for the Reuters scheme and like totally bombing in the interview, which is really humiliating and still hurts. But I got my break. Well, I kind of, when I left university, I got a job. I applied for, I'm sure you can all understand, I applied everywhere. I think a real key is, if you want to be a journalist and you want to succeed, is to really believe in yourself, and you'll get countless knockbacks. And you just have to roll with those kind of punches. I mean, I've had so many times when I'm just so upset and devastated at the latest rejection letter. And actually, I'll tell you an embarrassing story. I remember I went out. It was when I had my first job in journalism was as a producer for TV Tokyo. So that's a Japanese television station, and it was their sort of Europe bureau, which was based in London. And I wanted to be a print journalist to start off with, but I just couldn't get a job. And so this was the first job I could get. And obviously, used my language skills and was fascinating. But I remember still applying for other jobs. And I remember I bought this big roll of pink foam and cut out an enormous footprint, and then sort of stuck my CV on the front. It was like a giant kind of footprint. And then stuck my CV on it. And I remember painting the toenails gold. And then, stuck my CV on it and then wrote on the top of it, "Now I've got my foot in the door. How about giving the rest of me a chance?" And I sort of marched into the ITV buildings and posted it to Channel 5. And I think I got some work experience out of that, but I didn't get a job.
Very creative.
But yeah, so I basically... yeah, exactly. How embarrassing. But my first job was with TV Tokyo. But like I said, I really wanted to be a print journalist first. I thought, I kind of in my head thought I wanted to start being, grounding. You're just relying on information and you're producing the information, and then build on that to become a television journalist. That was kind of this weird idea I had in my head at the time. So my proper break really came when I got hired by a magazine called IP Asia, Intellectual Property Asia, which was part of the it was part of a bigger kind of magazine company. There was like the main magazine was called Euromoney, and I was based in Hong Kong and working for this magazine. And while I was there, I managed to get a job with AFP, which is one of the big news agencies, so Agence France Presse, and it was to be their economics editor in Tokyo, which was a really senior job. And it kind of goes back to that point about languages setting you out. Like, I was clearly totally ill qualified for the job, but because I spoke Japanese and I also spoke French, they gave me a chance, and that was definitely my break, my lucky break. And that was in May 2001, and obviously a few months later the September the 11 attacks happened, and that changed the world, and it also changed for journalists, especially sort of foreign correspondents. It was this huge historic event, and I can just remember feeling I really wanted, first of all, to go to Afghanistan, and so that didn't happen because I was just starting out at AFP as their economics person in Tokyo. But when the Iraq war happened, then they allowed, about a year after that, I got my first chance to go to Iraq with AFP, and that's kind of really how I started in journalism.
It's fascinating, thank you. So before Sky, you worked at the Times as defence editor. Can you just tell us what that was like and what it was like covering conflicts?
Yeah, of course. So like I said, my first time in Iraq was in February 2004. So that was with AFP. And I remember at the time I'd been in Tokyo for the agency, and they'd moved me to Geneva with the promise that, if I went and covered it was like the sort of the UN agencies that are based in Geneva, and obviously also Swiss News. But I get the chance to go to Iraq, and so that's what happened. And I remember my first trip there. I'd never been to the Middle East before, and I'd never been to Iraq before. And I remember being told that I had to fly to Amman and get a taxi to Baghdad. And they told me to take $2,000 and stuff it down my pants in case I got hijacked, because they wouldn't look there, apparently. But I'm joking. But I remember that was my first kind of moment of going in, and it was around the time when the situation there, it was already really bad. It was already bad and dangerous, but it was a real turning point when suddenly foreigners became more targeted, and there were these horrific rise in this sectarian killing and these suicide attacks and these like mass casualty bombings. And so I covered that. I did some stints there with AFP, and then I left AFP and I moved with AFP to London actually, and I covered the London bombings in 2005, and then after that I moved to Reuters. So I did sort of fulfill that dream of getting to Reuters, which I had when I was younger, and but I only did that for a few months, and then this job came up at the Times to be their Iraq correspondent. And so I moved out to Baghdad to live with the Times, and I did that for 2 years. And then I came back to the UK because I had my first child. So it's one of those sort of slight issues of being a female journalist. Life does happen every now and again, and obviously I had to come home to have my son, and the Times kind of made me their defence correspondent. And then I remember applying for the job of defence editor while I was on maternity leave, and being really nervous about it. But amazingly, they took they promoted me to defence editor. So I was the first female defence editor for the Times, and obviously at the same time a young mum. So I think that was a real, it shows that you can have a family and have a career in journalism doing that kind of thing. I was in Afghanistan when my son was 4 months old, helping to report on the conflict there, and then and so that was when did I start that? Sort of beginning of 2010, I went to Afghanistan several times, and also to the Libya, like the Arab Spring happened, and obviously in 2011 a huge focus was the conflict in Libya. So I did go there a few times, and then obviously the horrific conflict in Syria. And I didn't actually get a chance to go to Syria. I had my daughter in 2013, and then I had another child in 2016. So it's kind of that time as defence editor. Obviously, it was very full on, but at the same time, that was also when I had my children too.
Yeah, that's really, really good. I like how you said that you can do both having family and work. Like, it's really good to know
and the attitude has really changed. Like, I remember, you know, even just like a decade, 2 decades ago, there was a different attitude towards, you know, women when they had children compared to now, definitely in newsrooms, I think. And especially with men being able to take paternity leave, I think that's such an equalizer. It's really important and really empowering. Yeah, for both men and women.
Yeah. So you won the Amnesty International Award for an investigation into Iraqi interpreters. Can you just tell us how that came about and any struggles that you faced whilst doing that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. It was actually when I just arrived in Iraq with the Times, and I remember going down to Basra, which is in the south of the country, and that was where British forces were based. And you go on these things, they're called embeds, where you embed with the military. And so I did a number of embeds with the US military, and that would be sort of elsewhere in the country. But if you wanted to cover the British forces, it would typically be down in the south. And so I was doing an embed with the British troops. It was around the time, so this must have been sort of 2007. And it was around the time when there was very much this strong political pressure to get out of Iraq. It was an unpopular conflict, and even though the conditions on the ground were not conducive for the kind of rate of departure that actually happened, that was still the political direction, and so that was what was happening. And I remember going down there, and while I was with I think I was just literally going and seeing some kind of training exercise or something, and this Iraqi interpreter kind of came up to me, and very, very courageous, and just started telling me about the situation for the interpreters and how they were being targeted by there were these Iranian-backed militias that were very strong in southern Iraq, and viewed anyone who worked with the coalition or with the Iraqi government as traitors. And obviously the interpreters fell into that category, and they were being, you know, there were these horrific stories of interpreters being kidnapped and then tortured, horrifically tortured to death. And it so happened that one of their friends had literally just been killed at that time, and this interpreter had a letter to Tony Blair. I think Tony Blair was Prime Minister at the time, or maybe it was Gordon Brown. To the Prime Minister. I think it was Tony Blair. It was when Tony Blair had visited. It wasn't at the time when I spoke to him. It was before, and he'd tried to get this letter to the Prime Minister about the plight of the interpreters, and it had gone to one of the aides, and the response he'd been given was something like, you know, oh, just check out the government website and, you know, you can apply for a visa. It was a complete fob off. And I can remember this, just being told this information and being like, you know, being really distraught to hear this suffering by people that were clearly working, they were allies, they were working with the UK government and the UK diplomats that were there, and, you know, they were kind of like their eyes and ears, because they were helping them to understand what the local people were saying and feeling, and yet they were being targeted. And I can remember just thinking, like, what can I do about that? I feel like he's come to me as if I can help. I wasn't, obviously I knew I could write about it, but I didn't appreciate just the power of what journalism can wield. And it was the Times really got behind it, and kind of made it into a campaign really to help to raise awareness about what was going on, and that really helped. It changed government policy. And so a colleague of mine, Larissa Brown at the Daily Mail, she's done similar work to help raise awareness of the Afghan interpreters who've had the same kind of difficulties. And it resulted in government policy changing. It wasn't perfect, but it did mean that many interpreters and other workers were able to move to the UK with their families.
It's amazing work. So as well, you've broken stories from Brexit to Russian disinformation, like so much. Do you ever feel anxious when you are breaking these big stories? And why, if so?
Yeah, no, you always, whenever you've got like a big story that you're doing, you always, I'll always feel like so nervous, like wanting to make sure that I've got everything correct, because often you're relying on your contacts, because if you're reporting on something that maybe the government doesn't want to be reported on, then they're obviously not going to be massively happy for you to be doing it, and so you do come under pressure. And I definitely when I was at the Times, I did a lot of work around the defence budget and how there was this massive black hole in defence spending, and the government at the time would be talking about the growing defence budget, and it was kind of all smoke and mirrors, and the reality was actually that the military capability that the UK has had was dangerously underfunded and hollowed out, and so reporting on that required a lot of work, building contacts and getting information, and then you put it out there, and it is like it can be quite uncomfortable. And then doing, there was I've got this podcast that I launched about 3 weeks ago, called, not that I'm plugging it, but it's called Into the Grey Zone. And it's all about the way that countries compete and fight in the modern world. Like, why go to war if you don't have to? Why go to war if you can influence the population in a target country through disinformation, through corrupting their politics, through hostile takeovers of their companies, so that you can coerce financially people to do your bidding? And it's all very, very invisible, hard to prove. There's so many people that believe conspiracies that you can be accused of being a conspiracy theorist yourself, even though you're trying to shine a light on the truth. And for journalists, you are in a hostile environment. You do feel, if you look at sometimes on your Twitter notifications, there will be aggressive messages. And, for someone who, I spent time in somewhere like Iraq, where there was the danger of death. You did hear car bombs. You did see the result of physical violence, and you did understand, while it wasn't a conventional conflict, there was very much a sense of, you knew when you were under fire. You knew when there were bullets coming towards you. You knew when there was a danger of an explosion, or you didn't know, but when it did happen, you knew it had happened. Whereas now, and this is something that I've really felt ever since really kind of 2014, with the Russia's annexation of Crimea, in that sense that you had the Skripal poisoning in the UK, that sense that there are these kind of attacks happening under the threshold of war. And that really means that for journalists, you're on the front line too. You can be under fire, and it won't look like how you'd imagine war to look, but it can be just as damaging when it's influencing people's minds. And so, so you definitely, when you're writing about this sort of thing or reporting on this sort of thing, you're putting yourself out there and you're putting yourself up to be attacked.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Just kind of going on from that, with more and more people using social media like Twitter and stuff, when you have broken stories or posted stuff, have you ever faced like any extreme backlash? And if so, how have you gone on to deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, I don't really cover the coronavirus pandemic. I mean, this is a bit random example, but my colleagues, my political colleagues do. And I found it, like, when the pandemic started, obviously, everyone's work pattern radically changed, and I did a few shifts at the weekend, where I would be like the main correspondent. I only did it on a couple of weekends, but I remember having to cover the daily press conference, and you have to ask a question, and oh my goodness, like the horrific backlash you had from just complete strangers who didn't like the way you asked your question. And like my colleagues that do this day in, day out, it really is quite a hostile environment, because if people don't like the way you phrased a question or think you're being unfair, and obviously you're just trying to do your job, you're just trying to get information. But like I said previously, it can be quite hostile. And then there was a particular incident, and it started in 2018, where, and I've actually, well, I'm plugging my podcast, but I've done a piece about this in the most recent episode about exactly these kind of attacks. And there was this a suspected hack of an organization called the Institute for Statecraft, it had a program called the Integrity Initiative, which was aimed at countering Russian disinformation. And this hack happened, and all these names were sort of leaked as part of it. And hacking and leaking is kind of another weapon in this grey zone. And yet my name was in one of these leaked documents, and people kind of then assumed that I was somehow associated with this program, and that caused, there was like an awful lot of attacks on Twitter then when that happened. And it was really uncomfortable, because I was like, completely oblivious, and then suddenly I was coming under fire and being accused of being a government stooge, and it was like just not true. But how do how you saying no, people have got an opinion and think that that's the case, they've seen some document and therefore it must be true, aren't going to believe you. So it's hard. It can be quite depressing as well.
Yeah. So I don't know if I'm going to be addressing the elephant in the room right now, but back in July you did go a little bit viral when you were on live TV and your son came in. So we just wanted to ask really, how have you coped and balanced the working from home, like mixing with your family life sort of thing?
That was so embarrassing. I'm so glad you mentioned it. It's been really difficult, because obviously, like Charlie, who is the son that likes biscuits, and I really don't, because I was having to, it's just very hard. When he was at home, I was like putting him in front of the television, and he'd be in front of the TV for like hours sometimes, and his like little personality was changing. So I'd sort of try and kind of get him to do like train sets or something outside the door. But then if you're doing like, they've Sky have got us to be able to, they've given us like kit so we can do live broadcasts from home. And so I'd be doing a broadcast, I'd be like, is he going to come in? Like, really hope not. Like, and you roughly know what time you're going to be doing the broadcast. So I'd always know when to kind of make sure he'd be maximum interested in something, and then be like, okay, we've got like 10 minutes here, and hope that it didn't get delayed. And honestly, on that occasion, I'm sure I had given him food of some sort, like cakes or something, and put him in front of Paw Patrol, which is one of his favorite TV shows. So I was like, I wasn't even thinking it. So if I knew that he was like outside the door or somewhere, then I'd at least be thinking about it and being like kind of conscious and waiting to hear a noise. But I was like totally not thinking about him. I'm like, right, he's gone. So I was so surprised. It was awful. It was one of those things where I'd kind of like played out in my mind, like obviously it could happen, but when it did happen, like all my kind of like contingency planning just went out the window, and I was just like this blubbering like shush. But I was like, thank goodness, it could have been so bad. Like he could have asked something really embarrassing, and I could have like been like, shut up, and like pushed him or something, and then like I'd have gone viral for all the wrong reasons. As it was. It was okay.
So kind of following on from working from home and during the pandemic and everything that's brought, is there any changes that you think that have been made to your work because of the pandemic that you think will be adopted post-pandemic? Yes,
that was very forceful. It's interesting. So I'm obviously by background, I'm a newspaper journalist, really, as in I've been at Sky for 2 years, and I still feel like I'm a bit of an amateur, like trying to sort of sound professional, whereas I'm very comfortable behind my laptop, tip tapping on a computer. And at the time, you literally could work anywhere anyway. So there was not a culture of you had to be sitting at your desk. Like they would, it would almost be like, why are you sitting at your desk? Why are you out sort of, meeting people and contacts? And I could file, I turned like a Starbucks in town into like into my kind of office. And I'd often just be filing from a Starbucks somewhere. Sorry, I'm promoting Starbucks, but it would happen to be Starbucks. So I was very ill about 3 years ago. And when that happened, the Times were very, very much trying to encourage me to do more working from home, like at least once or twice a week trying to work from home, and that really does, so it is possible. You can file from home. It makes absolutely no difference. Obviously, if you're doing like a really big story, it's good to be in the newsroom so you can talk to all the key editors and make sure that you're really plugged in, but you can do it from home. So when I moved to Sky, and obviously for obvious reasons you have to be in front of a camera, so you clearly can't work from home, and it was quite a bit of a culture shock to be having to be in a newsroom or on location. Like obviously on location is a bit different because you're away, but to do your job, to have to be in the newsroom to do your job was just a very different mindset and a different way of working. And I do like the fact that now, and I wonder if it will be continued, but I do think it's great how we can just pop up from our wherever we are, from home, from my bedroom normally, and do a live about whatever it is, and also there would be this before, if you wanted to get a guest or a voice for your package, you'd have this big logistical challenge of having to get a camera, make sure the person can do it. Whereas now that you can get the scope for more people just popping up on their laptop means that you just have much more options of voices that you can have in your pieces. And I really hope that continues too. I think that would be great.
Yeah, thank you. So just lastly from me, and then till we go over to the Q&As. So is there any favourite stories that you've worked on that you would like to tell us about?
Like the stories that I was most kind of proud of, I guess. Well, definitely you touched on the Iraqi interpreters. That was something that you really felt you had an impact by writing about that. Also, like I really felt the work that that the Times did on trying to raise awareness about why defence matters was really important. Trying to raise awareness about why you need to have security, why security can't be taken for granted. We live in a world that's enjoyed relative peace and security, at least in the Western, sort of the Western hemisphere. Enjoyed the benefits of this world order that has grown up from the end of the Second World War, and it kind of means, having lived in a place like Iraq where there isn't security, that you really you can see how everything doesn't work if you don't have that fundamental foundation of not thinking there could be death happening at any moment. And I think that kind of trying to make people raise awareness about how you shouldn't take that for granted is really important, and it's work that I did at the Times, and it's work that I'm doing at Sky as well, and trying to sort of talk about how the nature of threats have evolved, and how it's not something that you can just expect the government to handle. It's something that every single person really needs. If you value the freedoms that we all enjoy, then we should protect them too.
Thank you. So now it's over to Orla. You want to ask some questions?
Thanks for answering all those questions. It's so interesting, and we've had so many come in. So I'm going to start with one from Beth, which is, she was wondering if you had a mentor when you started working as a journalist, and if you did, how did you go about getting one, and do you have any tips for aspiring international news journalists? That's a lot there.
That's a great question. I didn't have a specific mentor, because like sort of my path to getting into journalism, I think most people's paths getting into journalism are different. It's such, I remember I used to be so jealous of like my friends that would be like lawyers, bankers, or doctors, and it would be like there's this path you go through, and it's like a trodden path, and you know where you are. It was almost like being at university still, whereas as a journalist it is kind of unconventional, and there's no set or right or wrong way. But I do think I would have loved to have had a mentor. I definitely had people that I would go to at different times. So I remember my first kind of, I had work experience when I was trying to get a job after leaving university. I was given work experience at APTN, which is the Associated Press's TV arm, and it was in London. I remember I think I was paid £6 a day for my travel expenses, which cost £8. that I was paying for the benefit of being there, which obviously you have to do these things, don't you? But I remember at the time there was a senior producer there who was a really good sounding board for me. So I do think you will find when you do go into these news organizations to do your work experience, that you will build relationships with people. And I'd often go back to him and ask him his advice. Like I remember when I got offered the job with TV Tokyo, at the same time, like I'd applied for the Cardiff University's postgrad newspaper course. And I hadn't been accepted. I hadn't made it through to the course initially, but then they got in touch sort of like later in the summer to offer me a place. You know, they'd scrape the bottom of the barrel and there was my name. But I remember at the same time, I'd just been offered this job with TV Tokyo. And I remember going back to this guy and being like, and also a woman at Guardian, because I'd done some work experience there, and being like, you know, what should I do? And both of them were like, you know, don't be crazy. Like people go on these courses to get jobs like the one you've been offered. So you absolutely should go for the job. Which I did, and it was definitely the right advice, because you know you're doing the journal, and I do really believe that journalism is, you know, it's important to understand the law. It's important if you want to be a print journalist. I'm a very strong believer in shorthand. Learning shorthand is such an important skill, or at least being able to touch type. But journalism is a vocation that you can only really learn by doing it. But I definitely found, though, sorry, this is a long answer, but it's an important, it is in to help you understand what it's like. I did find, so I had that job at TV Tokyo. I went to Hong Kong with IP Asia, and then I went to AFP, and AFP gave me this incredible chance. You know, really took a chance on me, and that was definitely the moment when I'm finally, you know, I'm working for a global news agency. But I did then find that when I wanted to move from AFP to, I tried to move to the BBC, I tried to move to different news outlets, that I was hitting this wall of not being NCTJ qualified, which obviously you get if you go on these courses. And so in the end, I did do my qualification, but I did it by correspondence. And as soon as I had that tick, it didn't really matter. To be honest with you, it didn't matter. The jobs I got next weren't based on that at all. But I definitely was excluded from jobs because I didn't have that. So that I thought that was quite interesting. And I've definitely found the shorthand has been really, really valuable to be able to do that.
Yeah, that's really helpful and really good advice. And this is kind of on the similar vein to that. We've got a question from Kieran saying, so I'm currently a trainee reporter covering straight news. How does someone go from traditional news to covering foreign affairs? You've mentioned working at the wires to get abroad. Is that the best way, or is there other paths?
There's genuinely no set rule. I definitely think having a language is really important. I mean, you know, my Japanese meant that I got the job at AFP. I genuinely, I've barely used Japanese, so it's not obviously the most common language. But speaking French is really important. That just really helps. I think having a language is really important. And then, even if you don't have a language, I think often it is just, if you can, going and basing yourself in a country and then pitching from there. Like I've never done that, but I know, you know, a lot of people will do that. But equally, it is a difficult one. You know, when it comes to covering conflict, it is much more sensible to do that as part of a big news organization, because there's issues of insurance, there's issues of safety that you just maybe wouldn't have the same kind of protection, obviously, as a freelance. But equally, you know, there's lots of people that do that. I think for me, I did it through the agencies. It wasn't I didn't have like a set plan or an idea of what I was going to do. It was just what happened, you know, the opportunities that arose that I then took. But definitely, if you are interested in being a foreign correspondent, then you know, getting in with one of the agencies is a brilliant start, a brilliant way to do it. You can see the world. They are based all over the world, and you are the nuts and bolts of the news. And I think that's such a good place to ground yourself and really learn the trade.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And kind of, you mentioned conflicts. I'm going to go to this question from Iona. So she says, hi, and how do you prepare yourself for stepping into a war zone? What kind of steps do you take before departure to ensure you're ready for what you're about to face in both researching and networking, but also like emotionally and for your mental health?
Well, I mean, you're supposed to go on these hostile environment training course, which kind of all journalists who do go to places of conflict, they will, you have to have been on one of these courses. It's every sort of, I can't remember, 2 or 4 years you go on them, and it just makes you it helps you to think, because you're obviously a civilian. So it helps you to think about things like a high velocity bullet, unlike in the movies, will pierce through a car like paper. So don't hide behind one of those, and can actually pierce through a concrete wall too. And then, I mean, the most useful thing from these courses is just how to deal with catastrophic injury. Like, obviously, you never ever want to be faced with that, but better to be faced with that with at least some knowledge, some basic medical knowledge, than not at all. So yes, that's definitely, you definitely should do that. And then, I mean, I can only talk about it really and credibly in the context of when I actually lived in Iraq, and I would go there. So I would be there I'd go for like, I think it was about 8 weeks at a time, 6 to 8 weeks, and then I'd come home for about 3 weeks. It'd be kind of to decompress, because it is quite intense when you're. It's not actually. It was most of the time. It's totally fine. It's an incredible. It was an incredible country, an incredible privilege to cover the story there, and just so much. You'd meet every single person that you met would have a story that you just couldn't believe in terms of loss and suffering. So to be able to be in a position to help shine a light on that and report on it was just really incredible. And on the few occasions when it would be dangerous, then obviously you have to deal with that. But I remember writing letters to my family, like goodbye letters, just in case I did get killed. But that was I didn't really, to be honest with you, my whole philosophy about it did change when I became a mum. Like my kind of risk calculator, I guess you call it. I can remember being in Afghanistan and being under fire, and or like, I wasn't in a panic or anything, but I can just remember thinking that I didn't want to. Just thinking about my son. He was only 10 months old at the time, and just thinking about him. So that definitely changed my perception of what it was like to be out there, and my thought process about going to places like that. But to be honest with you, I haven't really been anywhere. I haven't been in that sort of situation for quite a long time now.
Yeah, it's really interesting and kind of harrowing when you think about, you said, like writing that letter to your parents, family, and kind of similar to that, Katie is asking, how did you deal with the culture shock when you were going from like living in the Middle East for 8 weeks and coming back to the UK? Did you get a culture shock going, and also when you came back to the UK, and how did you deal with that?
It was more, I would find it, I would find it more coming back weird, because you'd be immersed in a country where there was such suffering happening, and the thing that I found, which really touched me, was in the beginning, when I was with AFP in early 2004, the death of one British soldier or one American soldier, or I think it was about 5 or so Iraqi civilians, would warrant what's called a snap, like a you know, if you see on the bottom of television channels, there'll be like breaking news, and there'll be like a little ticker tape telling you what the breaking news is. And it's usually based on what the news agencies have just reported. And they would do a snap, which would appear on news screens all around the world. And then by the time it got to 2006, I think I'm right in saying that it still warranted a snap for one British soldier dying, but I think it had to be 3 Americans, and it had to be at least 25 Iraqis. And it was that sense of this horrific violence was happening, but we were somehow all becoming kind of immune to it. You know, the tolerable level of violence kept on creeping up. And so I'd find that very difficult coming home to the UK, and people not really wanting to, not being that, you know, it was not that they weren't interested, but it was just that getting annoyed about the photocopier not working, for example, where, you know, people in Iraq were living without electricity. I found that quite you know, it's not, I'm not saying I'm like making my sound out, I'm not, it's not judgmental at all. It was just the different realities of these 2 different countries.
Yeah, definitely. Sounds like 2 very different places. Kind of leading on from that question from Esther is, what was the impact of seeing the catastrophic reality for the citizens of Iraq? Like, did that affect you in any way?
Yeah, well, I mean, I remember, I mean, yes, of course. It's hard to compute when people are telling you what's happened. And I can remember, I'll share a story which really touched me, because it really kind of speaks to just how bad things became. I mean, obviously, you know, Saddam Hussein was not a popular leader. He was a dictator, and he was hated by the majority of his people. And in Iraq, I had these 2 brothers who worked for the Times, and had been with the Times since the invasion, and were just you know, incredible, courageous. They were kind of did everything. They drove me everywhere, and would be like my eyes and ears, and you know, it's just they knew what was going on. And they were from a large Shia family, and members of their family had been tortured during Saddam's time. And so they were no friends of Saddam, and celebrated the invasion and the liberation of Iraq. But then, after years of insecurity, of daily bombings, of sectarian death, and of corruption, I remember going with them we did a story about that. There was this like almost like a mausoleum in Saddam's birth village near Tikrit, where his body had been like laid to rest, and it had kind of become like a place where people would go and, you know, mourn his loss. And I remember going there, and one of these 2 colleagues started crying, and I was like, why are you crying? And he was like, you know, as bad as things were during Saddam's time, they are worse now. And I can just remember being so devastated to hear that. And what's more, I mean, that was probably 2009 that he said that. The following year, he was killed in a car bomb. He's father of 2. That really affected me.
Wow. So we're gonna kind of move back onto more like journalism advice questions.
Sure.
And this one, which I think is definitely important for the time we're in now, is from Johnny, and he says, how do you switch off from the news, if you can?
Oh, that's a really good question. Have a baby. Honestly, I'm really bad to ask that question. I'm definitely like, my job is my life, kind of, it's my way of life. Like, I define myself through my job almost, and it's part of who I am. And so I literally never or every night I'm looking at the front pages, and I've always been like that. So I don't, it's not healthy. But I think And I was always like that. So definitely, I'm kind of half joking, but having my children definitely gave me, that definitely stopped me from following the news so much. Although they get really bored when I put, the Today programme on over breakfast and go, oh, Mom, like, it's important that you know who the Prime Minister is. So yeah, I don't really switch off, I'm afraid. But like I say, it's like, I don't see it as, I don't do it because I have to do it. I do it because I want to. I find it really, it's sort of, I would feel weird if I wasn't listening to what was going on in the news.
Yeah, makes sense. And so we've got a question from Julia saying, so she says hi as well, and she says that she is currently applying for university courses and was wondering if you would recommend studying a language at university level as part of a combined course with journalism or just in your free time. So she says that she's currently learning Japanese and would love to live there, but is worried that there aren't many jobs in Japanese journalism.
Oh my God, you should definitely do it. So I am biased, but yes, I would say 100%, if you are interested in languages, learn a language at university. It's like an incredible skill. It also opens your mind to thinking about cultures in a different way. And it helps, so that helps as well when you come to report on different places. And yeah, it's true that it is quite niche, to be, you can be a foreign correspondent in Japan, but I definitely found, having done that, and you could, it's the stories that the rest of the world are interested in will either be kind of finance related, or annoyingly they'll be sort of like quirky. Oh, isn't this interesting in Japan? Like in terms of some strange thing that's that's unusual. And then there will be like the usual bread and butter murder and theft and scandal. But and there are there's English language newspapers there too. But it's one of those things, I can remember being there and being very conscious of, I got my job because of my language skills and not wanting to be a journalist because I speak Japanese, wanting to be a journalist because I'm a journalist. So I think, yeah, it's great to learn Japanese, great to go and be a journalist in Japan, but you need to have a conversation with yourself as to whether you want that, if you want that for the rest of your life, which would be amazing, or if you want to be a journalist because you're a journalist, not just because you're a Japanese specialist.
And I love all the talk about languages because I did German A levels. So like, it's very different to Japanese, but I do agree with you that languages are really important. And we've got this really interesting question from Ruby. And so she asks, how does it feel when you finished covering a story or get moved on to another story? Is it hard to move on, particularly if you feel the story is being underreported or overlooked?
That's a really good question. The thing is, like, I mean, news can be very fickle, and there'll be a focus on an event, and then as soon as it kind of wanes, then the interest from the news, from your editors, also wanes. I mean, a good example would be the Sri Lanka Easter bombings, almost 2 years ago now, and Sky sent out a big team out there, and we covered it. I think I was there for a couple of weeks, and it was, they put a huge amount of resource into it, and it was a really important, horrific story. But then obviously the news agenda moves on, and you have to move on, and because of distance, it was very difficult to keep across that story and across the investigation and what was happening. There were unfinished leads to follow, but it's kind of, there is always another big story, so there is always, it's like a perpetually living beast, news. And you're as a daily news journalist, which is what I am, you follow that, but in your quiet times, it's good to use those quiet times to focus on a project, so to have something going on in the background which you really believe in and really want to pursue. I think that's really important.
Yeah, definitely. And then I've got this question from Caitlin. What do you feel the main differences were between TV and print journalism?
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Oh, sorry. So the question was from Caitlin, and it was, what do you think the main differences between TV and print journalism are?
Oh, I love that question. 20 years ago, when I was starting out, there was a fundamental difference. You were either a print journalist or you were a broadcast journalist. And it was weird, like people seem to move from print to broadcast, but not the other way around. I didn't really understand why that, I still don't understand why that is. But it's all changing, like the distinction is blurring, and the distinction, I think, won't matter in the future because it's all becoming one. Like, you know, at Sky, there's so much emphasis now on digital journalism, on written content, on audio content, as well as obviously the television journalism. And you know, I look back at the Times, and the Times has its own radio station now, and they use video in their stories. And obviously, the strength of the newspapers will be their written journalism. The strength of the broadcasters will generally be their television content. However, they're, you know, both are producing fantastic offerings in the other's specialty. So I think, you know, being able to combine all is the way is how journalism is evolving. And in terms of the actual craft, it's very much like written journalism is, you know, it's you have your just as a talking about a general news story, like a hard news story, your top 5 paragraphs. Pretty much, you know, is a skill to be able to condense into those top 5 paragraphs a compelling and introductory line about what it is, and then the why and where and how, and in those, you know, and then you pad it out, reinforce with the rest of the story. In television journalism, you know, you need to just tell that story. You can't have lots of different thoughts that you can have in, you know, lots of different elements that you can have in a written piece. It has to be much more pared back, which may sound easier, but actually it's a real craft, which I still haven't quite managed to get on top of. It's a real craft to be able to do that well, and then that turn of phrase, clever turns of phrase, writing to the picture, so the picture leads the content, and the words just help you to understand the pictures better. And that's such, and it's like artwork. And, you know, people that do it well are incredible. So they're very different disciplines, but in terms of the actual media landscape, they are merging.
That's really interesting and kind of a bit similar to that, and it might be a hard one for you, but Tom says, if you could choose, which area of journalism do you enjoy the most, newspaper or broadcast?
Oh God, that is hard. Actually, do you know, I really enjoy, and I probably am, yeah, I would say this anyway, but I love where I am right now in terms of being able to do, you know, so and I feel embarrassed, like I'm not plugging my podcast, but there's this podcast project that I'm doing, and it's enabling you to do like long form journalism. And so you have this thing that's out there, and then I can write for the website, but then I can also do television packages for it. So it's like, and when you do a TV piece, you can write as well. And I think that is just, I really enjoy that. I really enjoy being able to, I am still learning on the TV side. So my crafting of television is it's clearly someone who hasn't done it for very long. Yeah, I'm trying my best. But then also being able to enhance that with a written thing, which you can then tweet about. And I really enjoy that. I really enjoy, you get a real buzz out of that.
This is maybe a slightly fun one. So this is from Mark. If you could interview one person that you have not interviewed, who would it be and why? Anyone.
Oh my goodness, that is a horrible question. And actually, that is the question that was the kind of question that really screwed me over in my Reuters graduate trainee interview. It was so humiliating. Like, I remember, I will share it kind of amongst friends. But I remember being asked in this panel interview with like these, you know, 3 people at the end of a long table, and they were like, if you could interview anyone, alive or dead, who would it be and why? And my mind just went completely blank. And I can remember just sitting there, and like sufficient time passed that I'm sure their bodies sort of moved forwards in anticipation for this profound answer that I was going to produce. And then I was like, Mr. Reuters? Oh God, how embarrassing. So yeah, I didn't get that graduate traineeship. But who would I like to interview? Oh, that's a rubbish. I'm not going to answer that because I've humiliated I didn't get a job out of that answer. I don't know. Like, there are lots of people out there that I'd love to interview.
Sorry, I brought back that memory for you, but it worked out well in the end. You got
yeah.
So we're just coming up to the last 5 minutes. So I'm going to finish with this question from Maddie, which is going back to your son asking for biscuits. And what biscuit did you end up giving him? That's what Maddie would really like to know.
Oh, I love that question. I gave him chocolate digestives. And then randomly he got the Radio 1 had these lockdown awards, and Charlie won not one but 2 lockdown awards for being sassiest kid of the year and Zoom fail of the year. And so Greg James called him up for a chat, and he was like, "So Charlie, what biscuits did you get?" And out of nowhere, Charlie, who clearly likes throwing sticks at wolves, was like, "I like chocolate digescas." What are they? So no, chocolate digescas. And then he said he'd like to eat them sneakily.
So it's lockdown famous. And then just to finish off.
Yeah, I'm his agent now, not his mum.
So because there was loads of questions, I've not quite managed to get through them all. If people have any more questions and they want to ask them to you, is there any way they can reach you? Just on Twitter, would that be okay?
Oh God, yeah. If you want to just email me, so my email address is Deborah, DEBORAH .Haynes, HAYNES @sky.uk. And I'm always happy to have a coffee or a chat with anyone who loves journalism and wants to get into journalism, wants some advice or wants to bounce some ideas off me. I'm always happy to do that. I always said, I remember after dealing with knockbacks when I was younger, and I always said that if I ever actually did get a decent job in journalism, that I would always try and help other people, because I kind of wished that someone could help me. So yeah, always happy to help.
That's wonderful. That's such a great outlook to have. I'm sure everyone on this Zoom call will really appreciate that. And thank you so much for joining us. It's been such an honour to chat to you. You've had such an interesting career, and just getting to know you a bit more has been wonderful. And for the people on the call, if you're interested, if you follow Deborah on Twitter, follow her podcast, and also Empoword Journalism have some more workshops coming up. So we're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and if you look on there, we've got lots more workshops coming up. And thank you all for joining us. Yeah, I'm going to finish up now and enjoy the rest of your day, Deborah.
Thank you for inviting me.